Let's talk about something you probably didn't learn in history class. What if the American Civil Rights Movement, one of the great moral crusades of the 20th century, wasn't just shaped by brave protesters and marches? What if it was also powerfully shaped by the global chess match between the United States and the Soviet Union? It's this wild idea that the fight for Black freedom was both pushed forward and, at the same time, put in a cage by the pressures of the Cold War.
Okay, so here's our game plan. First, we're going to look at America's big image problem on the world stage. Then, we'll see how civil rights actually became a tool for foreign policy. After that, we'll get into the dark side, how the Red Scare was used to absolutely crush radical Black activism. Then, we'll trace the shift from Jim Crow to a new kind of control, law and order. And finally, we'll unpack the long shadow the Cold War still casts over the struggle for freedom.
All right, first things first, let's set the scene. It's right after World War II. America is stepping up, trying to be the leader of the quote-unquote free world. But it has this huge, glaring vulnerability. And it's not military, it's moral. And this right here, this just lays it all out. On one hand, you have the American creed, liberty and justice for all. But on the other hand, you have the brutal, everyday reality of Jim Crow segregation, of whites-only signs, and lynchings. This wasn't just a domestic problem. This hypocrisy became a massive national security risk. And you can bet America's new rival, the Soviet Union, jumped all over this. They took images of American racism and turned them into powerful propaganda. They'd go to these newly independent nations in Africa and Asia and basically say, really? You're going to side with them? A country that can't even practice what it preaches? This was a global battle for hearts and minds, and frankly, America was getting hammered. So all this intense international pressure really forced the US government's hand. And what you start to see is this wave of reforms that were driven just as much by a desperate need for good PR as they were by any moral conviction. This brings us to a really key concept for understanding this whole period. It's called interest convergence. The idea is pretty simple, but it's incredibly powerful. The feds only really got serious about civil rights when doing so also helped America's image abroad and served its strategic goals in the Cold War. And honestly, the proof is right there in the timing. Just look at how this plays out. 1947, the Truman Doctrine commits the U.S. to fighting communism everywhere. Just 1 year later, bam, Truman desegregates the armed forces. Why then? Well, because military leaders knew you couldn't fight a global ideological war with a segregated, inefficient army, especially with the Korean War right around the corner. And if you're looking for the smoking gun, this is it. This comes straight from the government's own legal filing in the huge Brown v. Board of Education case. The Secretary of State himself is telling the Supreme Court, look, segregation is killing our foreign policy. It wasn't just a moral plea, it was a flat-out national security argument. Okay, but that's just one side of the coin. Now we have to talk about the other edge of that sword. Because at the exact same time, the government was slowly taking apart legal segregation to look good, it was using its full power to crush any Black activism that stepped out of line. And they had a whole playbook for it. Any activist who connected the fight for racial equality to a fight for economic justice, or, and this was a big one, dared to criticize American foreign policy was immediately labeled a communist. The Red Scare created this perfect climate of fear. And under all that pressure, even mainstream groups like the NAACP purged their own members, anyone with supposed radical ties. The result? The movement's goals were forced to become much, much narrower. So, the message from the top was crystal clear. A cage was built around what was considered acceptable protest. Sure, you could demand the right to sit at a lunch counter. But if you started to question the whole economic system or America's actions overseas, you'd be targeted, you'd be silenced. The human cost of this was just immense. I mean, just look at the tragic story of Paul Robeson. This man was a global superstar, an incredible artist and activist known all over the world. But after he made a speech suggesting Black Americans wouldn't fight a war against the Soviet Union, a direct critique of U.S. foreign policy, the State Department took his passport. Just like that, his international career was over. He was blacklisted, his income vanished, and he was nearly erased from American public life. Or think about W.E.B. Du Bois, literally one of the most important Black intellectuals in all of American history, a co-founder of the NAACP. At 83 years old, he was dragged into court, indicted as a foreign agent just for his work on world peace. He was eventually acquitted, but the whole ordeal bankrupted him and pushed him to the fringes of the very movement he helped create. And then there was Claudia Jones, a truly brilliant thinker who was way ahead of her time. She was developing theories of triple oppression, how race, class, and gender all intersect, long before it was common to do so. But because she was a communist leader, she was arrested, thrown in prison, and then deported, cutting off this vital link between the civil rights struggle in the US and all the anti-colonial movements happening around the world. So this purging of radical ideas, it had these huge long-term consequences. By the late 1960s, the Vietnam War was tearing the country apart, and the government's ways of controlling Black communities started to, well, they started to change. The Vietnam War just ripped the cover off of these deep, deep inequities. I mean, look at the numbers. Black Americans were about 11% of the population at the time, but they were over 16% of the draftees. And in the early years, they were dying on the front lines in some combat units at rates over 20%. And if you really want to see how stark this was, look at this program called Project 100,000. It was designed to draft men who had previously failed the military's aptitude tests, basically creating a pipeline straight to the most dangerous infantry jobs. An incredible 40% of those recruits were African American. The war acted like a destructive suction tube, just pulling poor Black men out of their communities and dropping them onto the battlefield. So now, with Jim Crow segregation technically illegal, a new system of control was needed. And wow, get this, shockingly honest admission from a top advisor to President Nixon. He basically said, look, we knew we couldn't make it illegal to be against the war or to be Black, but if we could get the public to associate hippies with marijuana and Black people with heroin, we could criminalize both and disrupt those communities. Jim Crow wasn't disappearing, it was just being replaced by the criminal justice system. So let's fast forward. The Cold War finally ends. The Berlin Wall comes down in '89. The Soviet Union is gone a couple years later. And just like that, the main geopolitical reason for the US to care about civil rights, it vanished. At the time, there was all this hopeful talk about a peace dividend. The idea was that, hey, the big enemy is gone. Now we can take all that money from the huge defense budget and finally redirect it to our needs here at home. Rebuild our cities, invest in schools, housing, jobs, all the things that had been ignored for decades. But that promise was never fulfilled. The peace dividend, that massive investment that was so desperately needed, it never really happened. And why? Well, you could argue it's because the external pressure, the need for America to look good on the world stage, had just evaporated along with its main rival. So this is the really complex legacy we're left with. The Cold War was, without a doubt, a catalyst. It absolutely sped up the end of legal segregation, but it was also a cage. It systematically destroyed the movement's economic justice wing. And the consequence of that is that we ended up with formal legal equality, but the deep, structural economic problems were left completely unresolved. It's the unfinished business of a freedom struggle that was both helped and handcuffed by world politics. And that leaves us with one final big question to think about. If the pressure to win the hearts and minds of the world was such a powerful engine for change back then, what's the engine for change today?